On June 24, 1991, the body of a wealthy 65-year-old widow is found in her beautiful home in the hills above Cannes.
Mrs. Marchal's corpse is found lying in front of the boiler room door.
Near the body, written on a door, are the words, "Omar, kill me." These bloody letters appear to name the killer.
It's out of the ordinary as far as murder mysteries go.
Omar Radad, the victim's gardener, is arrested and charged with the murder of Ghislaine Marchal. He protests his innocence.
He thought, this can't be happening. It's a nightmare.
On February 2nd, 1994, Omar Radad is sentenced to 18 years in prison. His lawyer, Jacques Berge, calls it a miscarriage of justice.
100 years ago, a young officer was condemned for the crime of being Jewish. Today, a gardener has been condemned for the crime of being North African.
A support committee is created.
The public was aware that injustice had been done.
A counter-investigation tries to prove the gardener's innocence.
The evidence against him seems unlikely.
Today, his lawyer wants a retrial.
It would be fair, but after how many years? How many years of suffering? How many years of hardship?
Jean-Marc Bloch, former head of the Versailles Police Department, and Negar Haeli, criminal lawyer, will join us as we look back on this case. We're in Mougins, a small medieval village in the hills above Cannes. It was here that one of France's most mysterious and high-profile criminal cases took place. On June 24, 1991, Ghislaine Marchal, a wealthy 65-year-old widow, was found dead in the basement of her luxurious home. Next to her body on a door was a sentence written in blood. "Omar, kill me. Omar, kill me." This sentence leads the victim's gardener to be indicted and convicted. Omar Radad, whose name will become for many the symbol of a miscarriage of justice. We're looking back at one of the biggest murder mysteries of the last 30 years and the struggle of a man who claims to have been wrongly convicted. Monday, June 24, 1991, in Mougins above Cannes. Here, huge villas rival each other in luxury, hidden behind high walls that protect them from prying eyes. Around 11:30 a.m., Erica Serrin arrives at the home of her friend, Ghislaine Marchal, a wealthy 65-year-old widow. She's been invited to have lunch and spend the afternoon by the pool. Outside the gate, she rings the bell, but no one answers. She tries again in vain. Worried, she tells a neighbor, Francine Pascal. Together they enter the villa. The door is open. The alarm isn't activated, but inside there's no sign of Ghislaine Marchal. The two women call the police. At 5:30 p.m., two investigators from the Mougins Territorial Squad arrive for what they think is a simple inspection. They find that the large villa is deserted.
When the police arrive, the house and the rooms are all in order. Obviously, the house hasn't been ransacked. The safe hasn't been forced open. Nobody has touched it. Apparently, none of Mrs. Marchal's jewelry is missing.
There seems to be no cause for concern, but Ghislaine Marchal is nowhere to be found. The only place left to search is her villa's basement, containing a boiler room and a wine cellar. It's accessed by an exterior staircase in the courtyard. The door is locked. With the key they find in the house, the police try to open it, but something is in the way. The door seems to be blocked from the inside. By forcing it, they manage to push back the object that's preventing it from opening.
The police find that the basement is in darkness.
The officers move forward by torchlight. To the right of the door, they notice a switch covered in blood. A little further on, in the boiler room, a mass spread out on the floor catches their eye. It's a body. Horrified, the two police realize they have just entered a crime scene.
Mrs. Marchal's corpse is found lying in front of the boiler room door.
The Cannes Criminal Investigation Unit is called to the scene. The shocking news spreads of a crime in this privileged and peaceful neighborhood.
I get in my car and go there, and I find myself in a neighborhood that I don't know at all, in the hills of Mougins, very affluent, residential, with bunker-like houses. And in front of the house, called La Chamade, I see men in uniform. The atmosphere is icy, so I go up and ask them, "What's going on?" No one answers me.
Inside the basement, the two officers are in for another surprise. Not far from the body, on the boiler room door, they notice strange marks that look like letters. But that's not all.
There's a more legible message, with clearer letters, on the door of the wine cellar.
On this other door, dark red letters appear to have been traced with blood.
The writing says, "Omar killed me."
Omar, kill me. This short sentence at the crime scene turns this murder into an unprecedented mystery. In the basement of the villa, the preliminary findings begin at 8:30 p.m., led by the Cannes Criminal Investigation Unit. The police discover, not far from the door, a wooden rafter covered in blood, a metal pipe, Ghislaine Marchal's luxury watch, and a mule. A little further on, there's a folding bed. According to them, this was the object that was blocking the door.
They're talking about a bed weighing between 25 and 45 pounds, if I recall correctly.
The police notice several traces of blood, concentrated between the entrance door and the boiler room. Samples are taken. What happened in this basement? The crime scene seems particularly violent. A medical examiner is dispatched to the scene to collect the body. The victim is wearing a blood-soaked bathrobe. She's lying on her stomach, her hands above her head. The police immediately spot that she is still wearing her expensive rings. While observing her hands, the medical examiner finds defensive wounds.
What's interesting is that on one hand, one finger is almost crushed, broken, even lacerated, which has undoubtedly held back or obstructed a blunt object.
When the body is turned over, numerous stab wounds are visible. The attack was so violent that the victim had been partially disemboweled. At the end of his inspection, the medical examiner concludes that the death occurred over 6 hours ago. The police leave the basement around midnight, with a first murder scenario in mind. Ghislaine Marchal was fatally assaulted. She tried to defend herself, but knowing she was dying, she was able to write her killer's name in blood. Omar, kill me. The next day, this barbaric murder makes the front page of the news.
Once the article appears, the next day, the media floods in.
There's everything here to attract attention, intrigue, and provoke a kind of media uproar.
Writing twice on two different doors with her own blood, Omar kill me and Omar K, is something that defies imagination.
The whole of France is now eagerly awaiting for the results of the investigation. Jean-Marc, we decided to look at this case even though it was solved, with Omar Radad being definitively convicted in court for the murder of Ghislaine Marchal.
Yes, but since the beginning, Omar Radad has been protesting his innocence, and not everyone accepts this verdict. There are two opposing sides, those who believe he's guilty and those who call it a miscarriage of justice.
Just a few hours after the discovery of Ghislaine Marchal's body, the media releases the details of the crime scene, and very soon, the public is fascinated by this story.
It must be said that this writing in blood, Omar kill me, is worthy of a detective novel. I clearly remember that everyone was wondering, but who is Omar? Did the victim really have time to write her killer's name on the basement walls? What if it was written by the murderer who was trying to misdirect the police's suspicions?
What did you think of this case when you first heard about it?
Like everyone else, I was intrigued by the crime scene. I've seen cases where the victim had told their relatives or even the police that if something happened to them, it would be the fault of so-and-so. But a victim writing the assailant's name at the very scene of the crime is something I've never seen.
Very quickly, the police imagine the following sequence of events. Ghislaine Marchal barricaded herself in her basement after the attack and succumbed to her injuries, just after having enough time to write her killer's name in her own blood.
According to their logic, the police think that the killer left and locked the door, And then when the police entered this cellar, they found that the door was also blocked from the inside by a folding bed. So they deduced that Ghislaine Marchal, fearing her attacker would return, gathered her last strength to barricade herself inside and to write the name of the person who had attacked her.
Since we've been doing this show together, you've kept saying, Jean-Marc, that to conduct an investigation, there must be a culture of doubt. After their preliminary findings, the police have no doubt that the message "Omar, kill me" was indeed written by the victim.
Yes, nothing at the crime scene contradicts or disproves that theory. So they drive into this lead written in blood.
The police's priority now is to find out who the infamous Omar is. Who is this man whose name is written in blood in the basement? They question Mrs. Pascal, the victim's neighbor and friend. This woman, who lives around 900 yards from Ghislaine Marchal's house, provides crucial information. Her testimony will guide the investigation. She only knows one person called Omar. He is a young man who works for her and for Mrs. Marchal as a gardener. The name Omar would therefore refer to Omar Radad. This 28-year-old Moroccan has been working in France as a gardener at luxurious villas in Mougins for 3 years. Upon learning that his name was written in blood on the doors at the crime scene, the neighbor, Mrs. Pascal, is dumbfounded. She was the one who advised her friend Mrs. Marchal to hire him.
She talks to me about Omar and says she doesn't believe it at all, that it isn't possible that the messages were about Omar. Omar, who she knows well, was working all day Sunday at her house. He had told her, "I'm leaving for Toulon on Monday to see my in-laws and my wife, who has just given birth."
Omar Radad is a young man who's well liked for his honesty, his discretion, and the quality of the work he does, even if sometimes he doesn't fully understand, because of the language barrier, the orders given to him about what to do or not to do. But Omar is well liked.
This is someone who's described as extremely gentle. I won't say submissive, but extremely gentle, obedient, doing his job, and not looking for anything other than that.
Omar Radad is married and has 2 sons. He lives in an apartment in Canet-Rocheville, 3 miles from Mougins. He has a clean criminal record. He is completely unknown to the police. However, just a few hours after the discovery of Mrs. Marchal's body, he becomes the #1 suspect in a particularly violent murder.
From that moment on, the police are convinced that the perpetrator can only be Omar Radad. It's written down. They look for him. They wrap the case quickly. They have not only a suspect, but one who's immediately deemed the culprit.
The police are convinced that the victim wrote the name of her killer, so they must urgently bring the gardener in. On Tuesday, June 25, 1991, the day after Ghislaine Marchal's body is discovered, the investigators go to Toulon, about 60 miles from Mougins. They know that Omar Radad has been here since the day before, celebrating Eid el-Kabir at his in-laws' house.
The police force, horns blaring, sirens on, arrive at the apartment building. Omar Radad is at the window and sees them. He doesn't step back or act worried. At no point does he think that he's the one they've come for.
In other words, Omar Radad behaves like a man who has absolutely nothing to be ashamed of.
And when they come to ask if Omar Radad is there, he comes forward, thinking it's about an issue with his residence permit. In short, a purely administrative problem.
Arrested on a quiet morning in front of his wife and 2 sons, Omar Radad is taken to the Mougins police station. Placed in police custody, the gardener is alone with the investigators. The officers show him photos of Mrs. Marchal's corpse and the bloody words accusing him.
He showed me the photos of Omar killed me. The first question he asked me was, "Why did you do it?" I said to him, "What have I done? I didn't do anything." He said, "Yes, Omar killed me. You were the one who killed Mrs. Marchal."
Seeing these shocking photos of the crime scene, the young man doesn't give in and remains adamant. He had nothing to do with his employer's brutal murder.
He doesn't understand how he can be accused of this crime. He doesn't understand how he can be accused of this crime.
The police have learned from Omar Radad's various employers that the gardener often asked for salary advances. Could it be that this young man who has just had a second child was driven by financial problems? What if a request for money from Mrs. Marchal had gone wrong? Questions and accusations come thick and fast, one after another, but Omar Radad keeps saying he's innocent.
He said, but Mrs. Marchal was like a mother to me.
But the police are convinced they have the killer. At the end of his police custody, Omar Radad is brought before the examining magistrate at the Grass Courthouse. The police allow reporters to film it. It's in this footage that the public first sees Omar Radad's face. In front of the magistrates, he keeps repeating the same sentence, "I am innocent." But the examining magistrate believes she has enough evidence against him.
Knowing he was innocent, he thought, this can't be happening. It's a nightmare.
Omar Radad is indicted on June 27, 1991 for the murder of his employer, Ghislaine Marchal, and immediately sent to jail in Grasse. 2 days later, the gardener meets his lawyer for the first time.
When I visit him for the first time in jail, I realize there's a language barrier. Clearly, I have to talk to Omar Radad like you talk to a very young child. So I immediately think to myself, but how could they have questioned Omar Radad when he doesn't understand what I'm saying to him?
Negar, we've just heard Omar Radad's lawyer express surprise at the fact that his client was interrogated without the presence of an interpreter. However, I thought it was compulsory when the accused person was of foreign nationality.
It's more a question of understanding the language than of nationality. The absolute requirement is that the implicated person is aware of what they're being accused of in any language they understand. Hence, the need to be assisted by an interpreter. And the right to an interpreter from the beginning of police custody is today expressly enshrined in law, but unfortunately, at the time, it wasn't so clear.
Then we should also point out that in 1991, a lawyer's presence in police custody wasn't a legal requirement. It wouldn't become one until April 2011. Do you think this would have changed anything about how Omar Radad's interrogation went?
Yes, with the law today, Omar Radad's interrogations during the custody would have gone differently. But I can't tell you, and no one can, whether this would have had any bearing on how the case unfolded. What is certain is that, first of all, the police custody would have seemed much less aggressive to Omar Radad because a lawyer would have been there to assist him, reassure him, explain the procedure to him, and possibly block the investigators' unfortunate attempts of intimidation. And secondly, following from the first point, the lawyer would have been there to remind him that as a person being held in custody, Omar Radad had a number of rights, including the right to remain silent and to be assisted by an interpreter.
Omar Radad was indicted on June 27, 1991 for the murder of Ghislaine Marchal. Today, we talk about indictment rather than inculpation. Why this change?
Because the term inculpation, derived from culpa, which in Latin means fault, included the idea of guilt, and was therefore contrary to the principle of the presumption of innocence. Therefore, with a law in January 1993, the term inculpation was replaced by another term considered to be more neutral, indictment.
In our case, you really get the feeling that the investigators did everything they could during police custody to get a confession. In his book, published in 2011, Omar Radad writes, "I've understood since that night why innocent people end up confessing to crimes that they didn't commit, just so they can finally be allowed to sleep or eat." Negar, what do you think about the psychological pressure exerted on people being held in custody to get a confession?
It should be noted that the rights of the defense were much less regulated at the time, and much less enshrined in the law than today. And it's a shame because it's obviously unacceptable to exert this kind of pressure. First, it goes against the fundamental principle which stems from the presumption of innocence. Because the accused person is presumed innocent, they have the right not to admit guilt and not to be forced to testify, and therefore they have the right to remain silent. Second, exerting this kind of pressure is the best way to weaken an investigation and even lead to a miscarriage of justice. When we start an investigation with the idea that a particular person is guilty, we don't allow ourselves to consider other avenues and we miss out important investigative measures. And to come back to Omar Radad Radad's horrifying statement, it's true. Studies have been carried out on the issue. The accusation causes a feeling of guilt. There's a psychological phenomenon that can lead a vulnerable and hypothetically innocent person to lose faith in their own memory, accept the idea that they've committed a crime, and end up convincing themselves of it.
When Ghislaine Marchal's body was discovered on Monday, June 24th, Omar Radad was in Toulon with his in-laws, so he has an alibi. But the investigators believe the crime was committed the day before, while Omar Radad was still in Mougins. This is obviously only a theory, because at this stage of the investigation, the day and time of Mrs. Marchal's death are still a mystery. However, the examining magistrate didn't want to wait for the results of the autopsy. For her, Omar Radad's guilt is beyond doubt. The investigation is wrapped up quickly. This goes down well because Ghislaine Marchal's atrocious death has caused a sensation on the French Riviera. The victim was not just anyone. The 65-year-old was a wealthy and powerful woman.
Mrs. Marchal was the successor to the former CEO of the Marchal Company. She was someone who belonged to high society in the French Riviera region.
Her background was very unique, I found out later. I'd heard the name Marchal since I knew of Marchal headlights, Marchal fog lights. However, I didn't know that Mrs. Marchal was the sister-in-law of the president of the Grande Route law firm, the former president of the Paris bar, and she was the sister of a magistrate.
Ghislaine Marchal, born Ghislaine de Renty, came from an aristocratic family.
She had character, she had personality, she was independent. She only said what she wanted to say, even to her own friends. She had a kind of secret, private life.
Ghislaine Marchal had one son from her first marriage, who lives in the Paris region. It was after her second divorce at the age of 60 that she decided to move to the Riviera.
She was a haughty and worldly woman, but very discreet. She didn't talk much about her life or what she did. Ghislaine Marchal lived alone in her villa, a billionaire's villa, you could say.
She was beautiful, blonde and very neat, and very well made up. They called her the lady with the rose, which obviously places her in the social hierarchy.
She was cultured. She went out a lot. She played bridge and went shopping in a Rolls Royce.
Why was Ghislaine Marchal, a wealthy and apparently low-profile proprietor, fatally attacked in the basement of her villa? The police try to establish when the murder took place. They learn that Ghislaine Marchal hasn't shown any signs of life since Sunday, June 23rd. That day, at 11:45 a.m., Ghislaine Marchal answered a friend's phone call.
She said, "I'm in the shower. I'll call you back. I'm getting ready to go out."
At exactly 11:50 a.m., Ghislaine Marchal ended the conversation to avoid being late for a lunch she had been invited to. But from 2 p.m. onwards, her friends, surprised by her absence, called her house several times, but the phone calls went unanswered. No one saw or heard from her again. Jean-Marc, we know that Ghislaine Marchal's last signs of life were on Sunday, June 23rd. We also know that she was found dead in a bathrobe, without makeup or styled hair. So according to the police, she must have been attacked shortly after making her last phone call at 11:45 a.m.
Yes, that makes sense. During that telephone conversation, she said she was going to have lunch with friends. However, she never went to this lunch, and no one heard from her again. It makes sense, but only intellectually. It doesn't accurately determine the date and time of death. For this timing to be as accurate as possible, we must wait for the results of the autopsy. All we know at this stage of the investigation is that Ghislaine Marchal was killed between Sunday at 11:45 a.m. and Monday, June the 24th at 5:30 p.m. when her body was discovered.
So nothing definitively rules out the possibility that Ghislaine Marchal was killed on Monday and not on Sunday, as the police are convinced.
No, nothing rules out this possibility, and that changes everything, because we know that on Monday at 8:30 a.m., Omar Radad took the train to visit his wife in Toulon, so he wouldn't be the murderer in that case.
Are you surprised by how quickly Omar Radad was indicted by the examining magistrate?
No, it's not the speed of this indictment that shocks me. No, what bothers me is how quickly both the examining magistrate and the investigators were convinced of Omar Radad's guilt. Remember, he's still presumed innocent, and no material evidence has been discovered against him.
So for you, Jean-Marc, the written sentence, Omar, kill me, isn't proof.
Of course it isn't proof, especially since it isn't corroborated by any other material evidence. It's simply a clue.
On June 27, 1991, the examining magistrate appoints 3 experts to examine the body and find out the causes of Mrs. Marchal's death. And of course, everyone eagerly awaits the results of the autopsy. The autopsy of Ghislaine Marchal is carried out on June 28th at Caen Hospital. The examiners count 13 stab wounds, divided between the neck and the torso. The depth of the wounds shows they were inflicted with a low intensity.
Some of the wounds on the chest and abdomen are not deep enough to penetrate. The lungs and heart are not affected. The wounds are on the chest, but have not entered the rib cage.
By studying the shape of the wounds, the medical examiners conclude that the injuries were inflicted with a double-edged blade measuring 6 to 8 inches long and 0.8 inches wide at most. Ghislaine Marchal also received 5 blows to the face and skull. These violent blows were inflicted with a blunt object, most likely the rafter found in the basement.
All the injuries we can see added up. Impaired consciousness from the head trauma was significant, but not enough to cause instant or very quick death. There are significant hemorrhagic lesions too, but not enough to cause cataclysmic hemorrhage. There's no damage to the vital organs. Everything added up and caused multi-organ failure.
According to the medical examiner, the disembowelment of the victim's body was not caused directly by the killer.
It can even arise from gasping. There are intense movements while gasping where, as a reflex, air is taken in and at the same time, the abdominal wall compresses. If there's a hole in the abdomen, then the intestines can partially come out.
Ghislaine Marchal would have been in her death throes for 15 to 20 minutes. But would she have been able to write her attacker's name before dying? The answer to this question will be essential to the rest of the investigation.
You must imagine that in a stressful situation, there's an extremely significant release of adrenaline. There's so much cortisol secretion, so much adrenaline secretion, so many secretions that try to compensate for all the wounds, bleeding, and bodily disorders, that the body itself doesn't send information about the pain.
According to medical examiner Bernard Marc, the difference between the 2 messages could be explained by the victim's worsening brain injuries as she gradually lost her faculties.
What's interesting is there are 2 messages, and from a physiological point of view, in one of them, the letters are visibly stronger. So there's coordination with the thoughts and the writing. There's much less coordination in the last message, where we have to figure out certain letters. Here we can imagine the progression of this edema, which gradually compresses the brain and ends up reaching the prefrontal and cortical areas, which control fine movements and coordination.
The medical examiners take 3 weeks to write their report. 3 weeks during which Omar Radad's lawyers know nothing about their forensic results. Once again in this case, the rights of the defense seem to have been violated.
And there's one thing which is, I would say, one of the biggest signs of contempt the justice system showed for the defense. Immediately after the autopsy, Mrs. Marchal's body is handed over to the family and cremated, depriving the defense of the chance to request a second opinion. It's beyond comprehension. And this ends up fueling this feeling even more, that they want to hide something from us.
It's unbelievable, Jean-Marc, that the victim's body was cremated even before the autopsy report arrived on the examining magistrate's desk.
Yes, it's absolutely unbelievable. In general, in such circumstances, the body is returned to the family with a burial permit, but cremation is prohibited. Cremation makes any second opinions impossible.
Do you think, like George Girard, Omar Radad's first lawyer, that this decision was made to hide evidence from the defense?
No, definitely not. That would put us in the realm of conspiracy theories. No, I simply think it's a mistake, a terrible mistake, which also clearly shows that the examining magistrate is convinced of Omar Radad's guilt almost before the investigation has begun. Returning the body to the family in this unimpeded way means she's convinced the gardener is guilty.
Another surprising thing is that the autopsy report doesn't give any details about the day and time of the murder. But this is crucial because, as we've said, if the victim was killed on Monday, Omar Radad can't be the murderer.
You know, experts are only required to answer the questions they are asked. As strange as it may seem, the examining magistrate, when appointing experts, did not ask the medical examiners to establish the time and date of death. Yet, we all know what the point of an autopsy is. It's to determine, on the one hand, the causes of death, and on the other hand, to date the death as accurately as possible.
In October 1991, more than 3 months after the autopsy, a new examining magistrate orders an additional autopsy. But this time, the magistrate finally asked the medical examiner to specify the time of death.
Yes, but there's no longer a body. It was cremated. So the experts will only be able to base their arguments on the notes and photos taken when the body was discovered and during the autopsy. This new assessment will always be open to question.
In this new report, dated November 2nd, 1991, the medical examiner concludes that the approximate time of Ghislaine Marchal's death was between 11 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. on Monday, June 24, 1991. It's a real twist. George Girard, Omar Radad's lawyer, immediately requests his client's release because on that date, as we know, Omar Radad was in Toulon.
Yes, but the defense's delight is short-lived, because in a memo dated December the 15th, the medical examiner writes to the examining magistrate that there's a typo in his report, and it should read not June 24th, but June 23rd.
So the request to release Omar Radad is refused. The young man's lawyers kick up a fuss, but the investigation continues. Now we know the time slot when the murder took place. It's time to check what the gardener was doing on Sunday, June 23rd. On that day, usually, Omar Radad was working on Mrs. Pascal's property, which is 900 yards from the victim's villa. The police want to know what he was doing between 11 a.m. and 1:30 p.m., when the murder likely happened. Where was the gardener during his lunch break?
He left Mrs. Pascal's property around noon.
Omar Radad then decided to return home. At 12:10, he stopped to buy bread at a bakery. At 12:20 p.m., he arrived at his apartment in Le Canet-Rocheville. He tells the police that he bumped into a neighbor.
While parking his moped in the courtyard, he saw the manager of a supermarket with his family, who lived in the same building as him.
Once in his apartment, the gardener had a quick lunch while watching The Price is Right on TV. Then around 12:45 p.m., he got on his moped to return to work. At 1 p.m., Omar Radad was back gardening at Mrs. Pascal's house. Immediately, the police checked this alibi. They questioned the salespeople at the bakery. None of them remembers serving the gardener. They also questioned the neighbor.
This person is questioned and says he doesn't remember seeing Omar Radad.
No one remembers seeing Omar Radad between noon and 1 p.m. For the police, the gardener's alibi doesn't hold up, especially since they find out that he didn't usually go home for lunch. Omar Radad's indictment is based mainly on 2 accusations written on the doors in Mrs. Marchal's basement. The examining magistrate therefore orders a handwriting analysis to find out if it was Ghislaine Marchal who wrote "Omar, kill me" in her blood. Two experts conclude that it was the victim who wrote on the basement doors. The letters are similar to those in her crossword grids. But for Omar Radad's lawyers, this is impossible. According to them, Ghislaine Marchal could never have written kill instead of killed.
Now, this was obviously used by the defense to say, but why would this distinguished, cultured woman have made such a mistake?
The investigators discover by looking at various writings by Ghislaine Marchal that she regularly made this grammar mistake.
She often made conjugation errors with the infinitive and the past participle.
Notably, this grammar mistake is found on her payslips to her gardener. In search of material evidence, the magistrate orders several expert assessments. In jail, Omar Radad continues to protest his innocence. The magistrate is hoping to obtain proof that he was in the basement on the day of the crime. The work clothes the gardener was wearing on the day of the murder are analyzed. Dust and sediment are found on his shoes. They are compared to the samples taken from the crime scene. They're the same, but in fact, these results prove nothing.
On further examination, they realize that these dirt and dust particles are not only found in the basement where the murder was committed, but everywhere on the property, as well as on Mrs. Pascal's property.
The magistrate then orders all the evidence to be checked for the presence of blood. The attack was so violent that it seems impossible for the killer not to have got bloodstains on himself.
Not a single drop of blood is found, even though we know that Mrs. Marchal was stabbed several times.
If positive, the results would have been damning evidence against Omar Radad. Negative, they still don't prove his innocence.
For me, the fact that a potential suspect isn't dirty doesn't rule him out at all. Centrifugal force causes the direction to shift away from the person handling the object. If I'm handling the object, if I'm the assailant, there's even a good chance that I'll be the least dirty.
It is also possible that the terry cloth robe the victim was wearing caught the blood spatters.
The knife passes through the garment and enters the victim's body. When it enters, it creates a force that projects blood, but it stains the garment. It doesn't go any further. The garment is so thick that after she's stabbed, when the blood comes out, it soils and stains this garment.
On the collected evidence from the basement and the house, no tangible proof connects him to the crime.
On Omar Radad's clothes and shoes, nothing was found that placed Omar Radad in the basement when Mrs. Marchal was killed.
None of Omar Radad's DNA or fingerprints were found on any evidence. Then, on August 22, 1991, a security guard at a casino in Cannes makes an important revelation to the investigators. He says he recognized a photo of Omar Radad in the newspaper. He's sure of it. This man often came to gamble at the casino. Behind the exterior of a family man, the police discover the gardener's dark side.
The investigation into Omar Radad's character was so positive, even complimentary, that it annoyed the police. They wanted to bite off more than they could chew.
Omar Radad allegedly had a gambling addiction. Several employees of casinos in the region are questioned. They formally acknowledge it. Omar Radad isn't a heavy gambler, but he regularly came to try his luck at slot machines.
They found some people who said Omar put coins into the one-armed bandits, the slot machines at the Cannes casinos.
According to the investigation into Omar Radad in his daily life, he gambled. He played slot machines with his gardening wages. Obviously, this could be problematic.
But that's not all. During his custody, Omar Radad, under fire from questions, admitted to visiting prostitutes. And even though he retracted this in front of the examining magistrate, explaining that he said it out of fear, the police follow this lead in Nice.
The police, in their hunt for a motive, failing to conduct a truly conclusive, objective, and satisfactory investigation, tried to demonstrate that Omar Radad sometimes saw sex workers.
And they found a prostitute who said Omar came to see her from time to time.
Omar Radad would therefore need money.
For all that, there was no evidence of the money that Omar Radad had allegedly gambled. But in this one-sided, unequivocal investigation, they were still looking for a motive that could have driven Omar Radad.
They're working backwards to incriminate him, particularly when it comes to prostitutes and the slot machines. It doesn't hold up. They're trying to incriminate him, to make him guilty.
To cover his spending, the gardener had got into the habit of asking for salary advances. These advances became more and more frequent, as Liliane, Ghislaine Marchal's housekeeper, tells the police.
So the motive could be that he came one too many times to ask her for money.
For the examining magistrate, this is what allegedly happened at La Chamade on Sunday, June 23, 1991. Around noon, Omar Radad would have taken advantage of his lunch break to visit Mrs. Marchal at La Chamade and ask her for money. Not finding her, he would have gone down to the basement, where the widow was undoubtedly busy adjusting her pool's heating. The discussion would have turned nasty.
Mrs. Marchal, given her strong character, lost her temper and sent him packing, possibly speaking harshly, which she was capable of, and maybe even humiliating him. And so he could have blown a fuse.
Omar Radad would then have attacked his boss using a rafter he found in the basement, followed by a knife. Then he would have left her for dead in the darkness by locking the basement door. He would then have gone up to his victim's bedroom to steal the cash she usually kept in her purse on her writing desk.
It was discovered that Mrs. Marchal, a week before, had withdrawn 5,000 francs from the bank and had spent 3,000 according to her receipts. So there were 2,000 francs left.
Omar Radad would then have returned to Mrs. Pascal's house at 1 o'clock to resume his work. Left for dead in the basement of her villa, Ghislaine Marchal would then have tried to protect herself and name her attacker.
Mrs. Marchal was furious, angry. This had happened 3 times. Maybe she told him off the same way, I don't know. Or she refused to give him money. Or maybe she had already given him it. At that moment, she got angry, and this surge of anger continued afterwards and perhaps contributed to her behavior when she was locked in the basement.
So it was out of anger that in the basement, Ghislaine Marchal would have first written her attacker's name on the door of the wine cellar. She then allegedly pushed the folding bed in front of the exterior door, using an iron tube and the rafter to block the access, probably fearing her assailant would return. Then she would have turned off the light and moved, with difficulty. She would then have tried a second time to write her killer's name before dying. The traces of blood in the basement seem compatible with this scenario put forward by the examining magistrate.
Everything points to the fact that she moved around, mostly on her feet. This is one of the reasons why not much blood was found on the scene, because most of the time she must have had her head above her shoulders. The blood flowed onto her shoulders, and her robe stopped it from falling on the floor.
While the examining magistrate thinks he has come up with the murder scenario, Omar Radad, in jail, begins a hunger strike in November 1991.
I visited him, and I was very impressed by his calmness and tenacity in the face of what he was being put through and what he was accused of.
For an innocent man, jail is completely unbearable.
I remember the words of the assistant public prosecutor, who said that the hunger strike could be a form of blackmail. I told the assistant public prosecutor, the difference between you and me is that you're reading a report on paper while I'm visiting Omar Radad regularly and seeing the situation he's in.
Omar Radad refuses to eat for 41 days.
It was extremely hard to make him understand that even if he no longer wanted to fight for himself, he had to fight for his children, for his wife, for his family. And perhaps that was what influenced him to stop his hunger strike, which had lasted for a very long time and had weakened him considerably. I thought Omar Radad was going to die.
Jean-Marc, there's an incredible contrast between the fight that Omar Radad is waging to make his innocence known and the unwavering certainty of the police and the examining magistrate that they have the culprit. What do you think of the alleged motive for the murder discovered during the investigation?
You know, money is a very typical motive in criminal cases. We must ask ourselves the eternal question, who benefits from the crime?
But if the motive for the murder was to steal the money in the purse, why didn't Omar Radad also steal the valuable watch and rings his employer was wearing?
I think it's very difficult to rob a corpse, and it's just as difficult to tear the rings off the fingers of a dying victim. It's extremely violent. To do that, you must be completely cold or devoid of any sentiment. But that isn't at all the portrait that's been painted of Omar Radad.
However, remember that Ghislaine Marchal's gold watch was found on the basement floor. It would have been easy to pick it up and steal it.
Yes, and it's even more surprising. If you think Omar Radad went rummaging through his victim's purse, you might wonder why he didn't also take the watch that had fallen on the floor.
The killer stole 2,000 francs from the victim's purse, which is a little over $325. I must point out, none of the gardener's fingerprints were found on this purse. But why would this young man have killed someone who paid him regularly and often in advance?
Yes, that's a real question too. The investigation established that Omar Radad often had financial difficulties and regularly ran out of money. We know that 10 days before the murder, his employer paid him a salary advance of 1,500 francs. You can't help but wonder why Radad would have killed the goose with the golden eggs. There's something wrong with this alleged motive.
Even so, the examining magistrate decides to send Omar Radad before the Assize Court of Nice. From now on, the high-profile and controversial attorney Jacques Berge will defend the young man. The prosecution is represented by Henri Leclerc, a famous lawyer and vice president of the Human Rights League. It's quite a lineup. The trial promises to be eventful. 2.5 years after the murder of Ghislaine Marchal on January 24, 1994, the trial of Omar Radad opens at the Alpes-Maritimes Assize Court in Nice. It's the biggest legal event of the year so far.
With this cast of lawyers, it looks like it's going to be a very high-level showdown. Because Verge has a reputation that can be considered scandalous, but his talent is recognized. As for Henry Leclerc, he's highly respected. At the same time, people are surprised because he's someone we never see on the prosecution's side. He's a defense attorney. He's a death penalty abolitionist. He's a lawyer who crusades for the people who are taken to court. So we're expecting a head-to-head, and we think it's going to be fierce.
Omar, how are you doing?
I'm fine.
Without physical evidence, a confession, or eyewitnesses, the impression that the defendant makes on the jurors could win them over. And from the outset, Omar Radad is full of surprises. After declaring his innocence to the press when he arrived at court, the defendant, once in the dock, adopts an extremely passive attitude throughout the trial, and he never addresses the court directly, because his lawyer, Jacques Berge, has requested an interpreter.
The lawyer decided to tell the Chief Justice that his client didn't understand French, and he needed an Arabic interpreter. And I remember the Chief Justice was very annoyed by this, because he knew his examination of Omar Radad was going to lack spontaneity and take much longer than expected.
He refused to speak in French, which put a damper on things, because there were doubts. People thought, he's been living in France for years. It's impossible that he can't speak French at all. So that probably shocked the jurors. For example, they were thinking, what is this strategy? How is this justified?
In the dock, Omar Radad seems to be somewhere else.
He didn't strike me as very emotional. He looked a bit absent from the start of the trial. That's the impression I had. A bit like he didn't realize he was in court.
The Chief Justice asks some specific questions. Omar says, or he has the interpreter say, that's nothing to do with him, and he should ask Mrs. Marchal's killers. So he sweeps aside the whole criminal charge sheet hanging over him. This, of course, makes everyone uneasy in the assize court, particularly the jurors.
Over the course of the debate, the lack of fighting spirit from the defendant as well as his lawyer Jacques Verge surprises the reporters.
Jacques Verge, to many observers, myself included, joined the case just before the trial. Obviously, he didn't have time to fully understand the case, and throughout the entire trial, he was a bit absent.
I remember Jacques Verge enjoying lunch under the winter sun in Nice, near the outdoor flower market. He had the attitude of a man who was digesting and taking a siesta when the trial resumed, with his arms crossed and his usual enigmatic attitude.
He didn't challenge anything during the entire trial, when really there were imperfections, omissions, and appalling shortcomings in the investigation. He never got up.
The Chief Justice seems annoyed by the debates and the defendant's silence.
I'm not saying he was a dishonest magistrate. Far be it from me to think that. But I am saying he was a magistrate who revealed his personal conviction that this man, Omar Radad, was guilty. He behaved like that anyway, and sometimes he spoke to Radad with a certain contempt.
According to some observers, the debates sometimes take an unpleasant turn.
He makes inappropriate remarks, notably about slaughtering sheep at Muslim festivals when he's questioning the wife. He seems like he wants to contradict the wife. When she says, he's gentle as a lamb, he says, yes, except he cuts lambs' throats for Eid al-Adha. So there's a discomfort which reflects the faux pas with racist undertones expressed by Chief Justice Gian.
A Chief Justice who doesn't hide his opinion, a defendant who doesn't loudly proclaim his innocence, and a defense lawyer who stays in the background. The prosecution's case prevails over the course of the trial. On the sixth day of the trial, the Chief Justice decides to drive his point home by displaying the basement doors with bloody letters.
We enter the courtroom and it's a shock. We see these two doors.
They were placed under the bar, the magistrates and the jurors. They were in plain sight. We could read them and get close and everything. So obviously, their presence was accusatory.
It's a bit crazy, as if during the night they've reconstructed the crime scene for us. The whole basement isn't in the court, but it feels like being inside the basement. And it's a terrible moment. It's a terrible moment because we see everything again. We obviously see Mrs. Marchal again. We see Mrs. Marchal again, and we reconstructed the crime. We try to reimagine everything she went through, everything she was able to do on her knees writing, "Omar, kill me," with this grammar mistake.
This staging is a fatal blow to Omar Radad's defense.
I'm convinced that this tactic stirred up strong emotions. At some point, it was carefully decided, carefully calculated. And that's not a fair way to conduct a debate.
This Chief Justice's approach, without a doubt, is to continuously demonstrate that the prosecution is right.
Every day, journalists report the events in the courtroom. More and more of the public takes an avid interest in the trial.
It was a trial with so much interest that I was asked to report to the newspaper at 8 p.m. every evening. From the first day of the trial to the last, France was fascinated. It was like a soap opera for the whole of France.
After an 8-day trial and 6.5 hours of deliberations, the verdict comes in. Omar Radad is sentenced to 18 years in prison for the murder of Ghislaine Marchal. Many people believe that in the absence of material evidence, the gardener should have been acquitted.
The verdict is disputed because many people, journalists, witnesses, and spectators, think he should have been acquitted. The defendant must have the benefit of the doubt. However, this wasn't the case.
There was no proof or confession. There you go. This 18-year prison sentence is based on the personal convictions of the jurors and nothing else.
It is then that Jacques Berge comes out of the woodwork for the first time. Facing a wall of cameras and microphones, he once again turns into the scandalous lawyer that everyone has been waiting for.
100 years ago, a young officer was condemned for the crime of being Jewish. Today, a gardener has been condemned for the crime of being North African.
He had just been sentenced to 18 years in prison, but you felt that this incredibly shrewd and provocative statement from Jacques Berge would trigger something else. And that was indeed the case.
From that moment on, the Omar Radad case takes on a political dimension. During the trial, the Chief Justice of the Assize Court repeatedly shows signs of annoyance. For some, he even showed bias. Did he step out of his role?
Yes, Arnaud. And if he did show bias, then he did step out of his role. The Chief Justice, according to the Code of Criminal Procedure that he upholds, is required not to reveal his opinion on the defendant's guilt and not treat them as a guilty party. First, because the defendant is presumed innocent. If not, if we had the feeling that the game was over even before the verdict was given, then we would think there's no point defending ourselves. It would reduce the defense to nothing. And second, because annoyance and bias are contagious. The Chief Justice who leads the debates has an influence on the jurors, who are also bound by the same neutrality, so all the more reason for him to hold back.
As soon as he left the court, Omar Radad's lawyer, Jacques Berge, called it a scandal and a miscarriage of justice. But what legal recourse did he have left to have his client's innocence recognized?
Usually when we're dissatisfied with a court verdict, we can appeal to have the case retried before the Court of Appeal, except that in 1991 it wasn't yet possible to appeal a court verdict, because the Assize Courts of Appeal didn't yet exist, and wouldn't be created until the year 2000. So, at the time, the only possible recourse was to appeal directly to the Court of Cassation, in the hope of having the verdict overturned and obtaining another trial.
Can you explain to us what it means to appeal to the Court of Cassation?
Appealing to the Court of Cassation means going before the Court of Cassation, the French Supreme Court, of which there is just one in Paris, to challenge a decision made by a court. However, the Court of Cassation's role is not to retry the case a third time by questioning how the crime took place. It's simply to check whether the previous judges have correctly applied the rules of law. So, to return to our case, Omar Radad's lawyers couldn't ask the Court of Cassation to rule on their client's guilt or innocence. But they could challenge what they considered to be violations of rules of law and procedure, and that's what they did, by highlighting the Chief Justice's lack of neutrality.
In our case, none of the defense's arguments are accepted, and on March 9, 1995, a year after the trial, the Court of Cassation ultimately rejects Omar Radad's appeal. His conviction then becomes final. But very soon, his lawyer, Jacques Berge, declares that he wants to secure a retrial for his client. Omar Radad becomes the symbol of a miscarriage of justice. A support committee is created just after his conviction, headed by Jean-Marie Rouard, a journalist, renowned writer, and future member of the French Academy.
The triggering factor was the verdict. Being a professional journalist means getting involved when a man's life is in question. That was the case. I wrote a series of outraged articles to say that the trial seemed completely unfair to me. Uncertainties weren't considered, which is the bare minimum in a trial.
Encouraged by Jean-Marie Rouard, many intellectuals from the left and the right signed a petition to request a retrial for the gardener.
There was a group, The support committee, which must have had about 20 writers and about 10 lawyers and magistrates. Even Sabine Mariette, the president of a magistrates' trade union, joined us. The public was aware that an injustice had been done. The only ones who weren't aware, to my great surprise, were the judges. It didn't create two camps in France, like the Dreyfus affair. It created one camp with a very large majority of people. In any case, there were polls, and I believe it was 72% of French people who thought Omar was innocent.
It became a phenomenon. It became a case of injustice against a backdrop of anti-Muslim racism. King Hassan II of Morocco, based on the reaction of the Moroccan people and certain sources of information, was convinced that Omar Radad was the victim of injustice because he was Muslim. He asked President Jacques Chirac to do something, and Jacques Chirac granted him a 4-year partial pardon.
Thanks to this partial presidential pardon, on September 4, 1998, Omar Radad regains his freedom after 7 years, 2 months, and 8 days in prison. When he walks out the doors of the Muret Penitentiary near Toulouse, the cameras are waiting for him.
When I met him, I was really struck by his gentleness, but also by his personality, which was really the personality of a man who inspires respect. And later, when I was elected to the French Academy, I brought him to the Academy. And that was the reaction of all the people who met him. He's a man who has presence.
Omar Radad finds himself surrounded by his support committee.
His release, that moment, was wonderful for him. But very quickly he broke down, saying, "I can't accept this. I can't accept being thought of as guilty."
Omar Radad then gets involved in his final fight to have his innocence recognized. Negar, on May 10, 1996, President Jacques Chirac granted Omar Radad a 4-year partial pardon. What does this mean?
A presidential pardon is when the President of France gets a convicted person out of part or all of their sentence. Jacques Chirac granted Omar Radad a partial pardon of 4 years, which allowed him to get out of prison 4 years ahead of the originally scheduled term. But in this case, the conviction is upheld, and the sentence remains on his criminal record. It just means he won't carry out the part of his sentence that has been pardoned.
So on September 4, 1998, Omar Radad was released. With the support of his lawyer Jacques Bers, he's determined to have his innocence recognized. The only possible way to do this is get a retrial. What exactly is a retrial?
A retrial is a highly unusual resort which aims to rectify the consequences of a miscarriage of justice, meaning the conviction of an innocent person. And you can see how this is different from a pardon. With a successful retrial, it's not just that the sentence isn't carried out, it means being completely exonerated.
So how do you get a retrial?
There must be new evidence that casts doubt on a convicted person's guilt. Broadly speaking, it happens in 2 stages. First, the court of review must concede the existence of new evidence. And then, and only if it is conceded to the first point, it must consider that this evidence calls into question the convicted person's guilt. If so, the court will overturn the guilty verdict and order the case to be tried again.
In 1994, Omar Radad's defense decides to call upon private investigators and has new expert assessments carried out, hoping to find new information. The counter-investigation, which is trying to prove Radad's innocence, also condemns the police's hasty and baseless conclusions. The counter-investigation highlights the failures of the case.
You can imagine that the police are not all Sherlock Holmes. Not all of them are skillful, and that's normal.
Omar Radad's defense even speaks out against the destruction of evidence.
We come across blunders. For example, Mrs. Marchal had a camera in her bedroom. The police took it, and they had the photos developed.
Without the examining magistrate seeing the pictures, at the police's suggestion, the examining magistrate allowed the police who offered to do so, to destroy the photos and the negatives.
Without revealing what was in these photographs. It seems absurd.
It's surprising that the last photos taken by the victim were not included in the case file.
They're not just hiding something from us. It's worse. They're destroying evidence that's been collected as part of a criminal investigation. Why are the police acting in this way? They're hiding something from us.
Roger Marc Moreau, the private investigator hired by Jacques Berge, criticizes the investigators' lack of objectivity. He maintains that Omar Radad's alibi was never properly verified. The gardener has always claimed that he bought half a baguette from a bakery in the Val de Mougins neighborhood around 10 past noon. The police concluded that this wasn't true.
According to the report, two employees told them they were certain that Mr. Radad did not come to buy bread that day. And when I went to question them, they told me, that isn't true. We never said that. One of them said, I was actually on the cash register, but I had around 800 customers. I don't remember if that customer I saw from time to time came that day or not. I don't remember. And the second one said, I was baking. I wasn't in the store, and so I can't say whether Mr. Radad came or not.
Roger Marc Moreau also interviewed the prostitute whose alleged client was Omar Radad.
And she also told me that she didn't recognize the statements written in her report because she was made to sign the report without reading it or having it read to her. But that wasn't what she had said at all. In fact, the man she saw simply looked like Omar Radad, but it was not necessarily Omar Radad.
It's known that prostitutes willingly agree to provide services to the police, if only to avoid being fined for soliciting.
But above all, the counter-investigation aims to discredit the very basis of the indictment. What if it wasn't Ghislaine Marchal who wrote Omar, kill me? What if the killer deliberately sent the investigators on the wrong track?
The experts claimed to have more knowledge than the jurors, which allowed them to say with absolute certainty, 100%, that Mrs. Marchal wrote the messages. And the new experts called in by the retrial committee said, no, we're not certain. We don't know if Mrs. Marchal wrote it or if it was someone else.
Jacques Berge asked Danielle Dumont, a handwriting expert at the Dijon Court of Appeal, to take a look at the bloody messages.
An expert isn't there to favor one side over another or go in the seemingly preferred direction. The expert is there to do their expert work and then draw specialized conclusions.
For Danielle Dumont, the conditions in which Ghislaine Marchal would have written the accusations against her gardener exclude her from being the writer.
When Mrs. Marchal does crosswords, her strokes are not confident, like when she writes freehand. These are out-of-context letters written without a firm hand. And when we look at the strokes on the door of the wine cellar, they're more confident than Mrs. Marchal's strokes. So it's rather strange that a person who's in agony makes more confident strokes than the same person in good health.
Danielle Dumont discredits the case's first expert assessments, which won over the jury in court.
What I conclude from this work is that she didn't write it. Now, despite what the experts and the person on the street may think, it honestly looks like it's staged. But that's my personal opinion at the moment.
So if Mrs. Marchal didn't write it, who did? Who could have wanted to accuse Omar Radad? The person who becomes the focus of the private investigator's full attention is Liliane, Ghislaine Marchal's housekeeper. In her testimony, she is not kind to the gardener.
This cleaning lady wants to drag Omar Radad down. It's pretty astonishing. And no investigation has been conducted into her or the people around her either. However, We know that Mrs. Marchal already suspected her of stealing money from her.
She wasn't questioned about her alibi. She wasn't confronted with her contradictions. And yet, we knew she had lied. She used her partner as an excuse. She didn't want to tell him. She was hiding the truth from him about a lover. All that, okay. The fact remains that this is the investigator's job. Why did she lie about where she was? Why all these contradictions?
According to the housekeeper, these lies had no other purpose than to hide her adultery. Then the counter-investigation uncovers a very surprising piece of information. The housekeeper's lover is a violent individual. He's been involved in several burglaries and has already been convicted of killing a man.
So we realize there's a man close to the housekeeper who has a serious record. And clearly, no one has investigated this lead. No one even knows about his existence. The question hasn't been asked. Who benefits from the crime? The people around her haven't been investigated.
There are a lot of questions we're asking ourselves, but this is just negligence, gross negligence.
In search of new evidence, Jacques Berge gets the Court of Revision's investigative committee to carry out a DNA testing of the rafter, the only murder weapon found so far, as well as the two doors. Two partial male DNA profiles are discovered.
When this news comes in, it's a shock. It's important to know that in 1991, no one paid attention to DNA. Back then, we didn't really know what it was. The DNA database came into existence in 1998, years later. So, at the time, I imagine the assailants didn't give it much thought.
The male DNA discovered on the rafter could belong to Ghislaine Marchal's killer. At Jacques Berge's request, it's compared with the gardener's DNA.
It turns out that this is not Omar Radad's DNA. It can't be Omar Radad's DNA. And that comes as a shock, because everyone thinks we've won the retrial because the real culprits will surely be found.
Omar Radad, who has kept a low profile since his conviction, breaks his silence and demands to be retried.
I demand a second trial for myself and for the whole of France, because I think many people in France are calling for a second trial, and they have a right to know the truth. That's all.
In his retrial request, Jacques Berge criticizes the investigators for not considering the possibility that Ghislaine Marchal wasn't the one who wrote Omar, kill me. Jacques Berge talks about the killer's Machiavellian ruse. What would the sequence of events have been according to this theory?
That morning, Ghislaine Marchal would have gone down to her basement to check her pool's water filtration system. There, she would have been assaulted. Her killer would have hit her with a rafter he found there before finishing her off with a knife he was carrying. Then he would have used his victim's finger to write the words, "Omar, kill me," and in a genius move of staging, he would then have dragged his victim's body to the bottom of the basement and written with her hand for a second time to make it seem like the victim wrote it while dying.
I sense a touch of irony when you say genius move of staging. Don't you believe it?
I don't believe anything. You know, an investigation is not about believing or not believing. It's about being able to verify. In my career, I have seen a lot of things that seemed implausible at face value. It's true this theory doesn't seem very credible, but I would never call it impossible.
Another mystery and another question. How could the killer have got out of the basement after barricading it from the inside?
Yes, a folding bed was blocking the basement door, but it's quite possible that the basement was not barricaded from the inside, but from the outside by the killer himself. We can well imagine that the killer placed the folding bed against the basement door. When he closed it, it would have fallen to the front of the door, thus preventing it being opened from the outside.
In his retrial request, Jacques Berge had high hopes about the two male DNA profiles found on the doors in the basement. Jacques Berge was convinced that this DNA would be the new evidence that would make Omar's retrial possible.
If the killer did carry out all these maneuvers, writing the text with the victim's bloody finger and closing the cellar from the outside, it is very likely that he left his DNA on the scene.
But finally, on November 20th, 2002, the Court of Review refused Omar Radad's request for retrial on the grounds that, and I quote, "It is impossible to determine at what point before, during, or after the murder these traces were left. This means that any additional testing of the genetic fingerprints that have been discovered, as well as any discovered in the future, have no relevance." Despite this immense disappointment, Omar Radad remains determined to get a retrial. Thanks to his new lawyer, Sylvie Noachevich, the case is relaunched, and the bloody messages once again become the center of attention.
While looking at the case file, while reading and going through the file piece by piece, I discovered a flaw. The DNA that was mixed with the victim's blood, the two DNA profiles, had been compared to Omar Radad's DNA. But they didn't go any further. They hadn't looked for the two people this DNA belonged to. This is a shortcoming, even negligence. You can't say that there can't be a retrial without knowing who this DNA belongs to.
In 2014, Sylvie Noachevich manages to secure new tests of the evidence, and the results surprise everyone.
This report reveals that there are 4 DNA profiles mixed with the victim's blood, not just 2. Because science has progressed. Scientific progress means that we can now see all the DNA. So 4 DNA profiles mixed with the victims on both doors.
None of these 4 DNA profiles matches Omar Radad's. Comparisons are then made on a larger scale, and 2 years later, in October 2016, there's a dramatic turn of events.
All of them were compared, but there was one that matched the DNA database, and a name came up.
The DNA of a man with a history of violence is discovered on one of the doors, mixed with Mrs. Marchal's blood. But there's a problem, because the DNA in the database is a partial profile. The Nice public prosecutor requests checks. He also calls for a new sample to be taken from this potential suspect. These checks take 2 more years.
They say the wheels of justice turn slowly, but here I have to say they're extremely slow.
It isn't necessarily at the top of the priority list. So let me be very clear. This case is not as high a priority as a murder that has just been committed in Nice. So it's only in the last few months that things have been done and samples have been taken from the person registered in the DNA database. And in the end, the answer is no. The DNA profile found on the door does not belong in any way to the person registered on the DNA database.
This is a new blow for Omar Radad and his defense. But the justice system's position is clear. Any new tests on the case file's evidence will be in vain.
These are objects that have been handled by many people, whether before or during the murder itself, and of course after. You can find as much DNA as you want, but for the moment, science, even today, can't say when this DNA appeared. Was it before? Was it after? In either case, it's of little interest to the investigation. Or was it during? That would be completely decisive.
Omar Radad's lawyer is counting on scientific progress.
The irony of this story is that these words accusing him will help to exonerate him.
At the end of February 2018, Sylvie Noachevich files a plea with the Attorney General of the Aix-en-Provence Court of Appeal against the Nice public prosecutor's stance that all investigative measures have been carried out. She is now demanding new DNA tests and new comparisons with the National DNA Database.
Yes, she's asking for the DNA discovered on the basement doors to be compared with the DNA of the people close to Ghislaine Marchal. Indeed, if Omar Radad is not the killer, it's someone who knew Ghislaine Marchal well enough to come up with the idea of accusing her gardener. It's someone who knew that Omar Radad worked regularly at La Chamade.
What do you think the chances are that Omar Radad will one day get a retrial?
It's difficult to answer that question, but I believe that the defense can count on advances in science and technology, and in the near future, we will be able to date DNA, that is to say, to know when it was deposited. So yes, under those conditions, it's possible the retrial request will be accepted and the case will be retried. But I have a feeling today that the magistrates are rather reluctant. They didn't really appreciate the partial pardon granted by President Jacques Chirac. In general, they don't appreciate those kinds of measures very much, even if they are rare. In fact, they believe that political and executive power infringes on their rights.
Today, Omar Radad lives between Morocco and France. Deeply affected by this case, he has never been able to return to a normal life. He has decided not to appear in the media anymore, but he is carefully following his lawyer's fight for a retrial.
I trust that one day Omar will be acquitted. I hope so, for the honor of justice and for the honor of France.
The difficulty is that the justice system doesn't like to question itself.
The more time passes, the stronger this conviction is in my mind. Omar Radad should not have been convicted in this case.
The defendant should normally be given the benefit of the doubt.
To tell the truth, we often ask ourselves what's more serious, to exonerate a guilty person or to convict an innocent one. And I think this notion is kind of the key to this case. Is it worse to exonerate a guilty person or to convict an innocent one?
Some criminal cases make history because of extraordinary media coverage. No one has forgotten the famous phrase, "Omar, kill me," written in blood. And everyone knows that Radad, sentenced to 18 years in prison for the murder of Ghislaine Marchal, has always claimed to be innocent. But all the rumors and controversies surrounding this case should not make us forget the victim, Ghislaine Marchal, a charismatic woman who loved the life she had chosen for herself. She called her property La Chamade, a flutter, as if describing how her happy life made her heart beat, a heart that stopped beating one day in June 1991. Good night.